looking at the geography, so we have people from Italy, Ghana, Istanbul, Kenya, very nice, Kazakhstan, Switzerland. Okay, we have pretty much all continents, the United States, very nice, very nice. Brazil. Okay, very good to see you. Very nice to see you all. Well, thank you so much, Professor, for being here with us. So we have Professor Alka Mauria and a very interesting, often overlooked, very often misunderstood topic of protectionism and international trade. Very timely too, because following the election in the United States, those of you who know, we had the election on November the 5th, a month ago, but it's another month before the new president is sworn into the office and becomes the president. But so far, President-elect Trump's program is protectionism. So he's threatening big tariffs on anyone and everyone. And so we know how it went the last several times presidents in the United States tried to protect local manufacturers by imposing import tariffs and using other protectionism measures. Maybe this time it will be different. But I'm curious to see what this lecture will teach us about protectionism and its effects on international trade and well-being of the local domestic producers. So, Professor, I'll turn the microphone to you. We are eagerly awaiting you sharing your wisdom and knowledge on the topic with us.
Thank you, Professor Vas, and thank you for giving this wonderful opportunity to be part of this particular wonderful series on Ex-Culture International Business lecture series. And I'm glad to be here to give a session, to take a session on protectionism and international trade. So this is how we go. First of all, when we talk about protectionism, we need to understand that what actually this term means. So if you look at the first figure, when we talk about protectionism, it basically talks about reducing the imports with the objective of promoting the domestic manufacturing. And various tools which are being used by government to protect the domestic market. Tariff is one of the very common options. Apart from that, there are import quotas, embargo, standards, and subsidies, which I'm sure as a student of international business, all of you must be aware about all these tools.
And to understand, but subsidies, that's to the domestic producers, I assume, right?
Yes.
So, okay.
Yeah. And to understand how protectionism and international trade are related to each other, let's try and have a historical perspective. And for that, we have to go almost a century ago, and I'll be starting from the events which happened right from 1920 onwards. So this is how I've structured my presentation. We'll be talking about the First World War, then the USA Roaring Twenties, Great Depression, the Second World War, and after the Golden Age. And then what is the current status right now? So when we look at 1914 to 1918, when there was a First World War, which was being fought between allied powers comprising of Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Romania, wherein the Central Powers were defeated, comprising of Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. So after that, after the First World War was over, the era of 1920s is also known as US Roaring Twenties, which had a brighter side and also a flip side. So if we try to look at the brighter side, US during that time was a huge industrial nation. And during 1920s, the economy also expanded because of a lot of factors, primarily because the economy was expanding and the nation's wealth almost doubled between 20 and 29. There was a lot of technological progress also, because of which there was mass production of goods, electrification, new mass marketing techniques that was being used in US, and also availability of cheap credit, increased employment, and also created a huge amount of consumers. And at the same time, since the manufacturing increased, the companies wanted more money to expand their business, because of which, again, a lot of credit companies, firms emerged. And the government also wanted to promote the domestic economy, so they lowered the taxes, because of which the business had more money to invest and public had more money to spend on consumer items. Also, at the same time, the tariff were being imposed on imported goods, so that more of the domestically produced goods could be bought by the consumers. During that time, the unemployment dropped from 11.9 million to 3.2 million. And it was being believed that 1 in 6 Americans had a car. And number of airline passengers also grew from 6,000 to 173,000 in 1929. If you look at the flip side, the decade 1920s, 1920 to 1930 is also known as decade of poverty because more than 60% of the Americans lived just below the poverty line. 5% of the wealthiest had 33% of the nation's income, and the income inequality was also increasing. Since I said in the previous slide, US had imposed tariffs, so the government of other countries also retaliated by imposing tariff on American goods. Because of a lot of production happening and the credit available at a comparatively low cost, the markets were flooded with goods that were not affordable to the masses. And also the middle class also focused on saving their money by reducing their spending, because of which a lot of goods in the market went unsold. Again, when the demand was decreasing, it led to closing of factories and sudden withdrawal of investment. Also, the profits of companies were falling. The workforce had to be cut, which led to increase in poverty and fueled a negative economic cycle. The stock price also was very high than their actual value. Consumer debt was proliferating. The agricultural sector was also struggling because of drought and falling food prices during that time. The bank also had given so much of loan that it could not be liquidated. The American economy entered a mild recession during the summers of 1929. The government also introduced the Smoot-Hawley Act, resulting in high tariffs on the goods imported into the country, because of which the US imports decreased by 66% to 1.5 million in 1933. Due to increased tariff, the trade between countries also went down. Towards the end of 1920s, the stock prices continued to rise and it reached such a high level which could not be justified by the expected future earning. Yeah. And in October 1929, the stock market crashed, which also led to onset of Great Depression. After US, if you also look at the European economy after the First World War, the economy was devastated because of the First World War. The surviving population had almost lost their jobs. Government could not did not have enough resources for reconstruction. And US during that time was one of the prime exporter to Europe. And all kind of commodities, all basic and advanced commodities were primarily coming from US during that time. And European government also had taken loan from American bank, could not pay them back, because of which, again, American banks stopped giving out loans to them. The purchasing power in most of the European countries came down. Imports from US also decreased because they did not have money to import to fund the imports. And again, this also led to sort of depression in Europe and set a scene for Great Depression. So the crash of stock market in 1929, the panic among the bank, which led to monetary contractions, and a lot of high tariff among countries led to decreased trade between each other. So these are the three major events because of which it's being believed that economists believe that it led to Great Depression. Again, because the countries were trying to protect their own domestic producers. They thought that whatever is being produced within the country should be consumed, and not enough goods should be imported into the country, thereby promoting the domestic companies. If you look at the total nominal GDP of US alone, in 1929, it was 0.105 trillion US dollar, which decreased to 0.075 by 1933. And if you look at the GDP growth also.
So the real one that's adjusted for inflation, or what is it?
Yeah.
Versus.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. So after that, a lot of policy reforms were being taken, which focused more on the economy, banks, and farmers, which were contributing more to the economic development. The Great Depression also ended with World War II, which was being fought between 1939 to 1945. And the American industry was revitalized after the war because many sectors were oriented to defense production by 1945. Then all of us are aware about the Bretton Woods Conference, which happened in July 1944 with 44 nations, and they agreed upon series of new rules for international monetary system. They agreed that trade should not only be just to promote international prosperity, but peace. The government also agreed that they have to to basically combat Great Depression, they have to improve, they can improve the economic situations only by reducing tariff and also addressing the currency fluctuations and not resorting to discriminatory trading policies. So the Bretton Woods Conference, the objective was to have economic cooperation and which could be achieved both by indulging in trade with each other. All of us know about IMF and IBRD, which officially came into existence after, as a result of Bretton Woods Conference. ITO was the third organization that was to be formed, but since the charter was not ratified by US, so it could not take off. But however, 23 countries in 1947 agreed for a free trade agreement, which finally was finally came into form as World Trade Organization in 1995. And after between 1948 and 1973, it's also known as Golden Age of US economy, wherein real GDP rose by 169%, employment increased by 75%, and manufacturing job increased by 30%, while the per capita income almost doubled during that time. So, taking clue from all the event right from World War One to the forming of international organization like IMF, World Bank, and also General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, the countries realize that economic growth and protectionism cannot go hand in hand. So if they really want economic growth to happen, they have to open up the economy. And that is why WTO also was being set up to ensure that there should be free and fair trade. If we try and have one more insights about how protectionism and international trade are related to each other, this is how the European economy have grown from 1960 to 1923. In 1993, EU was formed, and you can see that since then, the economy have grown exponentially. Similarly, if you look at China, China became member of WTO in 2005. And after that, the growth in the Chinese economy is actually can be seen.
That's
Similarly for India,
classic hockey stick shape. So
yes,
nothing, nothing, then boom.
correct. And similarly, we look at India. India adopted the liberalization policy way back in 1992. And if you look at the economic growth of India, it is also, though substantially less than China, but definitely the economy also have grown substantially. And currently, India is the fifth largest economy and is expected to become the third largest economy in another 3 to 4 years. This is a comparative chart of US, China, and India. So US 1960 onwards, you can see how the economy have grown similarly for China and for India. So when we talk about protectionism in international trade, so if we have to talk about economic growth, then it cannot happen with protectionist policies. And currently, this particular bar graph, if you can see, the blue one talks about the non-tariff barriers. Blue ones are technical barrier to trade. The orange one are the sanitary and phytosanitary regulations. And the line curve shows the tariff. So you can see that from 1995 onwards, the tariffs have come down. But at the same time, the other regulations in terms of TBT and SPS have gone up. So even though WTO was being set up to ensure free and fair trade, and currently there are a lot of controversies related to WTO only also. But the need of the hour is that if the countries and the global economy has to grow, then there has to be free trade. We're not talking about free trade now, we're talking about fair trade. And also the focus currently is on sustainable trade to achieve the SDGs, inclusive growth. We should focus on creating jobs and poverty reduction, reducing trade costs, supply side capacity, trade related infrastructure should be created. The service sector also have come up substantially during last 2 decades. And the focus should also be on that non-tariff barriers do not impede trade. E-commerce also have come up in a big way. And there should be support to micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. If we look at China, India, in China, approximately 90% of the total trade is being contributed by MSMEs. Similarly, in case of India, 60% of the international trade is by small and medium enterprises. And similarly is the scenario in other Asian countries, in Malaysia and so on. So, with such kind of policies wherein the small and medium enterprises also are being encouraged to become part of trade, the countries are ensuring that they should contribute to international trade by having all kind of organizations which should be having a substantial share as far as export of a particular country is concerned. So this is what I wanted to talk about. If you look at the entire series of events from 1920s till now, in most of the cases, the countries have grown only after they have opened up. So if the economic growth have to happen, the countries have to open up, even though there is a lot of debate and we are open to question now. Professor Vas told me that you should have a session you should speak for 30 minutes and we will be
Yes.
having 15 minutes for question answer session. So that is why I try to be as precise as possible to ensure that we can have more time for discussions.
And
So
a
this
big
is
thank you.
all from my side and I'm open for questions now.
And a big thank you to you for being on time. You're the last in the series, but the first who is actually on time. Everybody else ran out of time. So we have some time for questions, and maybe if I may, I'll add a couple more things from my own lectures, a little bit,
Yes.
just so that the students can. Yeah, so students, I have a question for you. Please put it in the comments. So in the United States, pretty much every president has tried protectionist measures to protect American manufacturers. So under Clinton, Bill Clinton in the 90s, it was against the Japanese steel. So you may know the expression, the Rust Belt in the United States. That's the states that make steel, like Pennsylvania, that sort of from Pennsylvania to Michigan. And so at that time, the Japanese were coming with their cheaper and better steel. And so American steel workers were losing jobs. And so the president decided to impose import tariffs on Japanese steel to save American jobs in steel industry. Then Obama was fighting the Chinese tires. So China came to the United States with car tires. They were cheaper. And so they decided to save American tire makers like Michelin, Bridgestone, and whatever else, again, by imposing import tariffs on Chinese tires. I think it was like 20%. President Trump, when he was the president, he tried the same with washing machines and some other appliances. And so we now know what happened. We now know that some jobs have been saved. So obviously, when there is an import tariff on a foreign product, obviously people would buy more local because it's sort of comparatively more attractive. So we can calculate how many more have been bought and as an extension, how many jobs have been saved. So my question for you is, how much do you think a saved job cost? Like, what was the cost of a saved job? So, for every saved job, how much more did Americans pay in the increased price of the product? Because import tariff is essentially a tax. So, when the product comes from China, if there is a, let's say, $1,000 for the phone, if there is a 20% tariff, that's $200 added to the price that the importer has to pay. So when we look at how much us consumers paid more for tires or whatever products contain steel or washing machines or whatever other products we were trying to save, and then divided by the number of jobs saved in the United States, how much do you think it was one job? Okay, so I have here some, and I think we may have talked about it in some of the lectures because you guys are right on the target. So somebody says 75 to $150,000. Somebody says 900,000. Somebody says 1 million. And so, yes, you are correct. So let me show you some of the calculations from the previous studies. So when 2009 war, so you can see my screen? Yes. 2009 tariffs on Chinese consumers. So we did save a few thousand jobs or a few hundred jobs, I believe, at the cost of almost $1 million per job. Then when we look at some other calculations here, so this was, yeah, so that's the calculations. And yes, so it was about 1,200 jobs saved at the cost of about $926,000 per job, almost a million. And so here there are some other calculations. Again, if you want to look at the originals, but then we can look at the same thing, for example, going on the tariffs on steel during the Clinton era. And so again, the calculation was roughly the same. So they saved about 50,000 jobs, if I remember correctly, but it was also close, yeah, $900,000 for every job saved. And then more recently under Trump, so appliances and washing machines, so import tariffs did save again like 1,000 jobs at a cost of $815,000 per job. So in a way, it sounds good on paper. We are saving American jobs, but when you look at how much more consumers have to pay, it's a very, very costly proposition. So we literally would have been better off just simply paying those people who would have lost their jobs, whatever we would think is a fair price, maybe for retraining, maybe for some sort of unemployment subsidies or payments, maybe, I don't know, invest in that job in creating completely different jobs. But just remember that saving jobs or protectionism might work, but keep the price in mind because that price can be huge. So anyway, so let me see what the questions here are. So Diana Wilson is asking, what do you think the world can expect from Trump's planned trade policy in the coming years? So Professor, if Trump goes ahead with his promised import tariffs, now he's talking about 100% tariff on all Chinese goods. He's talking about 20-30% tariff on Mexican and Canadian products. And then at some point, he was even talking on every import. So what will happen if he goes ahead with those plans?
I think, when we talk about international trade, US, when we talk about free and fair trade, doesn't mean that the economy should completely open up their economy. Even WTO have provisions that if there are certain concerns which is a threat to the economic growth of a country, they can come up with some kind of measures. So if US is coming up with such kind of, they already had imposed tariffs on imports from China, which I think was justified because even the India is facing a similar problem with China, that even though we had given great amount of market access to China for various products, but we do not find the same kind of reciprocation from the Chinese government. And the same thing is happening in US also. US is a huge market for China, but when we look at imports into China, definitely there is a huge trade deficit. So if a country feels that the economy is getting affected because of huge imports coming into the country, definitely they should come up with some kind of protectionism measure to justify that, trading with a particular country should be there should be some curbs so that they are able to protect the domestic market.
Yeah. And as
Because the tariff, which the US government again is now planning for BRICS nations and also for Canada, right? These are not the general tariff for all their trade partners. They have been very selective on increasing the tariff
yeah.
just to justify that there should be balance of trade between economies.
Yeah. It's interesting. So when Trump talks about tariffs on Canada, Canadian, and Mexican products, here the concern is not so much the job outsourcing, sort of stealing the jobs or unfair trade. The motives seem to be more political. I guess the rhetoric is that too many illegal immigrants are entering the United States through Mexico-US border and through Canada-US border. And I think in this case, he's threatening tariffs as a way to force the Canadian and the Mexican governments to do something about illegal immigration. So it's a little ironic because I'm not sure if it's a sort of justifiable approach to use economic sort of level, I mean, economic tools to deal with the political tools. I suppose you could, but it's interesting that the concern is not so much the trade deficit or unfair trade practices, but rather we want you to do this, and if you don't do it, we will impose import tariffs on your products. With China, I think the concern in one interview, Trump was talking about how China is being unfair when it comes to American-China trade. So he was saying first he was accusing the Chinese for accusing of manipulating their currency. So basically keeping their currency artificially cheap, making thereby Chinese imports or exports from China imports into the United States more competitive. And so he was going to impose import tariffs as a punishment for this unfair, in his view, monetary policy. Lately, he has not been talking much about that, but as you know, there has been a lot of tension. So China now limited export of rare earths materials that Americans need. And so China has been also trying to use some other means of basically promoting Chinese products and suppressing American products. There were some wars, like propaganda type of wars related to microchips. So China apparently has been sort of spreading information that American chips are not good and you need to buy Chinese. I don't know. I guess some call it advertisement, but somehow Trump is not happy about that. But there are also actually, when it comes to China, there are some tactics that China uses to sort of to block out foreign competition, not only the United States in general. So there may be some validity to we need to make it more fair. I'm not sure if tariffs is the way to go, but so that has been, the concern. So, but I don't know, do you know more, Professor, about this whole?
Yeah, just adding on to what you said, the issues are also related to IPR. That's also a major concern because of which many countries are have imposed some kind of restrictions for trade with China. In fact, when we talk about India, during COVID, Indian government had come up with a lot of restrictions on investment coming from China. That was because there also were a lot of apprehensions that Chinese companies were trying to were actually trying to acquire this the Indian companies that were going through a bad phase during that time, and the government never wanted that thing to happen. So a lot of restrictions on investment came up, and also when there was a border dispute between India and China during that time, also a lot of Chinese companies were banned. So that also helped us in addressing the issues related to national security. And recently, with a lot of these laptops coming from China to India, and the Indian government again wanted to promote its own industry, so they imposed a ban on laptops coming from China, though they later said that in CKD condition, it actually can be allowed. And also, when we talk about Apple, which is an American company, now they have their production base in India. And a lot of, I think 80% of the production actually is being exported from India. So, which is a major thing that's happening for the Indian economy because a lot of companies after COVID specifically are now investing in India. So, definitely, Indian government have come up with liberal policies. So we have this initiative of Make in India, wherein the government is providing a lot of incentives for companies to invest in India, to manufacture in India, and also to create India as a manufacturing hub. So there is a balanced approach. Then when the government feels that some investment or some product are causing harm to the domestic companies, definitely they are coming up with some restrictions. But definitely they also at the same time have a liberal approach wherein they want to attract foreign investments so that it also can give a necessary boost for economic development in the country and which also could lead to a lot of employment generation.
Yeah, there are some questions here related to basically, like, for example, an anonymous, I didn't give no name, but is asking about the cultural concerns when it comes to international business. And so I suspect that's what the student means. So sometimes protectionism may be not so much for economic reasons, but for cultural and national sovereignty reasons, so to speak. So I know that when it comes especially to cultural products, there may be sometimes promotion of local, for example, music or movie industries, and perhaps some restrictions on foreign products of that kind out of the fear that, for example, we've seen that in France, we've seen that in Ukraine. So the concern is that much bigger, for example, Hollywood industry or Russian movie industry will essentially displace the French language or Ukrainian language products. And so here it's not so much is that the trade is unfair per se, but rather the idea is that the nation needs to protect its own language, its own culture, its own artistic expressions, and being smaller, having a smaller sort of market. If you don't protect, obviously you cannot compete with, for example, English language, Hollywood. That's a gigantic machine with a market of billions of people. I guess in a way, India, I'm not sure, I'm not familiar with Indian movie industry at all, but I imagine that's like a billion users right there, local, but also I assume some of that is in English, so you can export it globally. So what chance do smaller countries like the Czech Republic or like, I don't know, Poland or Finland, I mean, can their movie industries and their languages compete given that the market is literally 1,000 times smaller? So I'm not sure if those kinds of protectionism are justified, but those are some of the reasons. I don't know. What do you think, Professor, about that? So would that be a justifiable reason to use protectionist measures or free market fall even in cultural products and industries?
Definitely, I could read Dinah Wilson have mentioned that Bollywood movies are awesome. And definitely, in fact, when we talk about India, we have open market here, and Netflix is very popular among the Indian consumers, and the Indian population is actually enjoying a lot of Hollywood movies. And I'm sure the Bollywood movies also are popular in other parts of the world. But definitely, when we talk about the Middle East countries, or countries that have still have not so open cultural background, definitely, they come up with such kind of restrictions that, similar. If we talk about our own neighbor Pakistan, they have some restrictions that uh, maybe some Hollywood movies cannot be shown, and stuff like that. So definitely, culture is also one of the reason because of which companies do come up with policies to restrict export and also import. In our case, currently a few of the states have put a ban on export of beef from India because beef is something very, very intrinsic to the cultural values of our country.
That's an interesting one. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. One obviously area where protectionism may be justified is the protection of infant industries or industries going through restructuring. So let's say, for example, if we talk about solar panels, so China or electrical vehicles for that matter. So China is obviously the world's leader at this time and apparently makes more of those products than the rest of the world combined. And so if your country, wherever you are, decides to develop its own capacity, capability to build electric vehicles or solar panels. So if you do not protect your startups from the Chinese established companies, they may never be able to develop to the point where they can compete. I mean, obviously, we have to be extremely careful here because if you extend the protectionist measures too much, then your companies may become too lazy, too complacent, I mean, too relaxed, and may not ever become competitive enough. But some believe that it may be justifiable to impose short-term protectionist measures to protect the companies while they're going through difficult times or just simply starting up and need some time to develop their technologies and supply chains and everything, because otherwise they may not be competitive against the cheaper and more established foreign imports. So
In fact, if I would like to quote some examples from my own country, right, we have seen liberalization happening from 1992 onwards. And before that, when we talk about, say, connecting to the whole world, we only had landline connection way back in 1980s. So we had to wait for months to get a telephone connection, that to a fixed line connection. But after liberalization, we have so many private companies that have also come up in this particular space that now we don't have to wait. We just have to go to a shop, buy a handset, a SIM, and we can actually get connected to the whole world within minutes. So that is how we have seen the transformation happening in last 30 years. And it is not just about the telecom sector, be it the aviation sector, the insurance sector, whichever sector have been privatized by the government, we have seen a drastic change from my college days or maybe my school days till this time when I'm teaching international business in colleges. So that is how, when the economy opens up or the country adopts liberal policies, definitely it leads to economic development. That is why maybe in 1990s we could not even think of India becoming a fifth largest economy or poised to become a third largest economy. But we have actually seen it in front of our eyes that only because of liberalization we have been able to achieve this position.
yeah, yeah. Ali Rehan is asking whether third countries should impose any import tariffs or other trade restriction imports. So I assume, like for example, if we're talking about, let's say, Poland and Germany, and we're talking about phones from I don't know, South Korea, for example. So assuming that the other two countries are not making the product, would it be advantageous for them to impose import tariffs? I will only say that from Adam Smith to just about every economist today, most of the time, economists believe that free trade is good. Free trade is one of the best policies that a government can enact and bestow on its people, but almost always universally it's unpopular. And so the question here is, do you do what's economically right or do you do what the populace, the people demand? And so I don't know what's right, what's wrong, but I know that it's not always easy to promote free trade policies, even if they make economic sense. So, though again, sometimes the partners are not fair, maybe you need to defend yourself at least for a short time.
I think there also always should have been a balance as to how much to open up.
Yeah.
If it is a threat to the economic development, definitely the government should come up with protectionist policies and add to what Ali have mentioned. Ali, let's take an example of Japan, wherein the contribution of agriculture is just 1% to the total GDP of the country. So countries like this definitely have to import,
Yeah.
right? So we also have to look at what is the composition of our GDP, which are the commodities which actually are very essential for economy to run. If we talk about, I think most of the countries, they have to rely on import of petroleum and petroleum product, because until unless we import, we cannot run our economy. So the government also have to look at as to what are the commodities which are very, very essential in our import basket.
Yeah.
And when we talk about completely opening up, as Professor Vaz said, I think this is not practically possible, and government always try to look at that whatever policies they have in place is to ensure that they are able to protect the domestic consumers, domestic manufacturers, and also try to strike a balance between economic development and the national interest.
There is a question for you, Professor, from Kribath Joshi. So about the green tax or CBAM or ESG tax, I don't know, those abbreviations must be something regional, but as a new form of tariffs, and how do you think these impact international trade?
Uh, uh, Rishabh, right? So, Rishabh, currently, when we are living in an era wherein everyone is conscious about climate change, right? And we know that until unless we will take some action to ensure that we are able to have a better future, some countries are having a lot of focus on sustainability. And definitely green tax is one of the initiative which we will see in times to come, because we have to ensure that the companies, the countries, the economies are having sustainable policies which are able to help us in saving our environment.
Yeah. How about there is a very interesting question here from again another one without the name here. So if Trump goes ahead with his import tariffs, 25, 60, 100% as he promises, can it help China beat the US essentially? So can it lead to the US becoming a lesser player in the global trade? Obviously, I guess that will reduce America's involvement in international trade. So can it actually be advantageous to China and disadvantage and harm the US economy and the US standing in the global world? Or do you think it will actually help the US?
Because in the past, when US also had imposed a tariff on China, during that time, it was not that the US import decreased. It was just that they diversified their imports. So whatever they were importing from China, I think it was there in news also that it will be an opportunity for India, Bangladesh, and all the other Asian countries. So definitely, some of the trade was diverted from to other countries also. And similarly, in the current scenario also, when the US is planning to impose tariffs. So I think, as far as I know, maybe Professor Bas will be able to throw more light on it. The objective, definitely, it seems to reduce the trade deficit which US has, and also the focus will be on promoting the domestic companies, which will also help in having more share in the national trade through exports. So I don't think that will have an impact on the US share decreasing as far as international trade is concerned. That's my take. Professor Bas, maybe you'll be able to throw more light on this.
I actually would prefer that we go to the next question because this one is not exactly my area, but the next one is an interesting one. So I'm curious what you have to say. I'm very, very curious to hear your answer. So the US dollar has been basically the global trade currency for decades now. And some like it, some hate it, some don't know anything about it. Lately, there have been talks about replacing the US dollar with some other currency. Well, lately is their own statement. For decades, on different occasions, countries have been talking about dumping the US dollar in favor of something else. So I'm not sure if this time it's any different. But we know that, for example, Russia's oil going to India is paid in Indian rupees now. China has been trying to promote payments in its own
Yuan.
currency, yuan, renminbi, I guess, whatever the official name. BRICS now are talking about maybe having some common currency. At least, the Russians said that maybe we should have a common currency, and that obviously prompted Trump to say, if you think about, a currency other than the US dollar for international trade, I'll impose tariffs on all of you. So what is your take on this, special status of the US dollar? And in general, should it be repealed? Should it be replaced? Should it be continued? So what are your thoughts on this matter?
Because currently, definitely, US is a most acceptable currency as far as international trade is concerned. And as you said, definitely countries are trying to have their own arrangements with India having a rupee trade agreement with a lot of countries and BRICS also now coming up with a new currency. But definitely, I think it might take time, or this actually seems unrealistic that, it can be replaced with some other currency in times to come. But definitely, as European Union came up with their own currency, and with if we have strong regional blocks like EU, definitely they can come up with their own currency to trade with each other. But definitely, when within the bloc, the currency might be acceptable. But when the countries will trade each other, definitely we will be having international currencies, and I'm sure dollar will be there.
Well, ironically, when the EU adopted a common currency, so while it did obviously make trade within the bloc much easier, no doubt about that, it also did create some challenges given the very different level of development, structure of the economy, type of the economy of the EU members. So it did restrict some of the governments in its ability to intervene when economic problems happen. And so a common currency for countries that are very different may potentially be actually quite problematic. That's a whole different issue of the common currency
Correct.
versus using, like, let's say, for example, Chinese or Indian or Brazilian or Russian currency for international trade. So that one does not require creating a new currency. But again, so there are all kinds of interesting issues around that. We are slowly running out of time, but I would like to ask you, Professor, two more questions. So one is a very interesting one from Snehil about steel imports into India. So as far as I know, India makes steel. If I remember correctly, the company, one of the biggest companies in the world, in fact, is what is it, Mittal Steel, if I remember.
Yes,
So at some
correct.
point they
Yes.
bought one of the Ukrainian big,
Arcelor.
yeah. So you make steel, and yet, according to this student, there are also tariff-free imports from South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and China. And so they, I assume, are competition to the local manufacturers of steel, producers of steel. So what are your thoughts on this import-free imports of steel? I mean, sorry, tariff-free imports of steel. Good, bad for India? Is it creating more competition, which is good, or is it taking Indian jobs, or something else?
No, definitely, as I said, the government have to strike a balance to ensure that there should be economic growth, and whatever policies are there in place, the domestic companies also have opportunity to have their share in the international market. And as Professor Vas said, India is one of the leading producer of steel. So we have a lot of domestic companies within the country itself. So Mittal Steels and the Steel Authority of India, a lot of PSUs also who are into production of steel. So definitely the objective of the government is to have a major share in the exports market. And when we have a lot of production happening within the country and a lot of products are actually being dumped, India had imposed anti-dumping duty, and the objective definitely is to ensure that the low cost product should not be dumped in the Indian market, and the Indian company should be able to retain and increase its share in the international market.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. There are very interesting questions, more questions. There is one about cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin. Maybe we will not touch it because it's much more complicated, cannot be answered in one sentence. So, on the one hand, it's a great opportunity. On the other hand, well, how does it change anything? I mean, does it matter if you pay in US dollars or Indian rupees or Bitcoin? And then, well, maybe that's the way to go. So, opportunity, threat, challenge. So, let's skip that part. There is also a question from Vikas Kumar about imports on Chinese steel by the US, which redirected much of that import into India, which potentially can be a problem again. So maybe we'll skip that. I want to finish maybe with this because we're almost out of time with a controversial question from Diana Wilson about your predictions of the next Great Depression in 2030. So do you think it might happen as like it happened 100 years ago in 1920? Or we should not be afraid of another big global Great Depression and crash.
Currently at times I believe that we are living at a time wherein it is difficult to predict the future. In terms of maybe, 5 years down the line, we did not thought about how technologies like AI and IoT, digital printing will bring in the kind of changes that we see around us today. So, where we will be 5 years down the line, we are in 2020, almost in 2025 right now. And after 5 years, it is really difficult to project that how these new technologies will be shaping the economic development of countries. And also, with the kind of growth that we are seeing right now and the growth which is being fueled by these new age technologies, I really don't think that the depression, if it is there, will have much impact on the economic development. It could be like we had recession in the past, wherein it started with US and the other Asian countries also had to face the heat, but definitely can't foresee that, the same thing might happen. And until unless we have another pandemic, like COVID situation happening, if the economy continues to grow at the same pace, we can't foresee the happening to such an extent. And we really don't know where these technologies will take us 5 years down the line.
Yeah, from my end, Diana, we've been talking about the next recession for literally 10, if not more years. So everybody predicted that it would crash when Trump is elected the first time. Then it didn't. Then that, well, socialist Biden will come, it will crash. It didn't. Then once this election is over, it didn't. So what I mean is it will happen eventually, no doubt. I mean, we will have another depression, recession at some point, and there will be a million of prognosticators who will say, "Oh, I predicted that back in 2000 or whatever, 2020." Well, the challenge is when exactly. So many people, including myself, have foolishly withdrawn from all kinds of financial instruments multiple times over these years, thinking, well, now it's going to definitely crash. And then somehow it didn't, and I lost. In fact, this time, had I known that Bitcoin would go up even more, or the stock market will go up even more once Trump was elected, I actually prefer that I would have not, I would have doubled down. So the challenge here is not whether if it will happen. It will, eventually it will. So whoever predicts it, they are correct. The question is when. Will it be tomorrow? Will it be a few months from now? Will it be a few years from now? And that's the key. Because if you believe those predictions and start not participating in market today because the doom is coming, you will be losing all those years of additional continued growth until it will actually happen. So, but yes, let's stop here. So there was one more question from Vikas. What if we impose import tariffs on products we sort of would like to restrict their import into the country, but then take the money that we get from the import tariffs and basically give it back to the people in the form of, for example, reduced taxes? Would that sort of solve the problem of the cost? The challenge here, and some economies work like that, like for example, Singapore or some port nations, so to speak. So many of them have very, very low income taxes, and they sort of substitute them with essentially import tariffs or some other form of import-export type of tariffs. So it might work, but again, you have to be very careful because you essentially will be taking money from some, those who buy the products, and giving it to others. And so it's much more complicated. You need to calculate who exactly will be losing money, who exactly will be gaining money, and is it good for the economy or not? I would say that always keep in mind the expression unintended consequences. It always seems like a good idea, but the economy is a very complex system and it can play out in such unpredictable ways that, what seems like a brilliant idea can easily backfire. So, but anyway, thank you so much, Professor. So we are out of time. Thank you for your time on a weekend, late night. So I'm sure you had better places to be. So thank you for being here with us. And I hope everyone has learned a lot today. So thank you. And so everyone with your quizzes, you will be getting emails from us within a few days. We'll allow a few days for you to finish all the quizzes. And then probably, hopefully sometime by the end of the next week, we'll have the final results and send out your certificates and recommendation letters. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Yukta. Thank you.
Thank you.
organizing this
Thank you
whole
so much,
series and this
Professor.
lecture in particular. So those of you who don't know, Yukta has been managing pretty much all of the logistics behind this lecture series. So thank you so much. Thank you again, Professor. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you, Professor Taras, and congratulations on successful completion of this series.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.